Cash Johnny Caine's The Minutiae, starring Vaughn Coovey. Episode 4, Wyoming Secretary of State.
Chapter 4. Vaughn Coovey, Wyoming Secretary of State, Cheyenne, Wyoming. By 8 o'clock, Vaughn had already walked the route from his corner office to the elections division enough times that the pattern felt almost ritualistic. Elevator down, 2 right turns, a left past the map of Wyoming's counties, then into the briefing room he had insisted on creating within his first month in office. The room existed for one purpose only, to surface what looked wrong before anyone decided what it meant. He took his usual seat halfway down the table, put his coffee at the same spot on the wood grain, and flipped open a legal pad. The Elections Division, under the direction of Winslow Turelli, had settled into the rhythm of these meetings. Debbie Wren, the division's lead data analyst, sat at the far end with her laptop already awake, Joven Aspenwright at her side with a second screen and a keyboard that never seemed to sit still. When she caught Vaughn's nod, she signaled Joven to dim the overheads. The wall screen lifted itself out of sleep and filled with the campaign finance dashboard. One by one, filters stacked along the top of the interface until it became a narrow lens, independent expenditures only, the Energy Reliability and Jobs Act, a 6-month window, and Wyoming registered entities with contributions above $25,000. The list contracted, reorganized, and then presented itself in numbers and names. 3 political committees dominated the field. Their names had already become familiar during briefings. Wyoming Families for Reliable Energy, High Plains Jobs Coalition, and Wind Ridge Citizens Alliance. Each month's reports had placed them among the top spenders on the ballot issue. Today, the dashboard added a layer behind them, itemized disbursements. On the big screen, the vendor column settled into a single repeating line. SkyTrail Communications. Joven toggled to a network view. Nodes appeared, grew, and linked. Donor entities on the outer ring, PACs in the middle, SkyTrail as a bright hub in the center. The pattern was simple enough for anyone in the room to understand. Money moved from a cluster of Wyoming LLCs and nonprofits into the 3 PACs, then flowed from the PACs out to SkyTrail month after month in clean pulses. No secondary media shops, no consulting firms trading places. No sign of the usual messy ecosystem of a statewide ballot campaign. Vaughn did not allow himself to attach adjectives to it yet. He treated the picture the same way he had treated the first depredation maps in his legislative days. An anomaly, not an indictment. Something to capture accurately before anyone layered a story onto it. He noted the basics in his own shorthand. Narrow donor base, 3 PACs, single vendor, consistent timing. He asked Joven to capture the network view exactly as it appeared, every filter setting and keyword, under a fixed label. The label he chose was clinical, not clever. Energy Initiative Complex, V1. He wanted anyone who opened it months later to see the same picture the team was seeing now. He requested a 1-page summary for the file in plain language. No jargon, no speculation, no adjectives that could be construed as opinion. The memo needed to state what the data showed, how it differed from a typical Wyoming ballot-measure spending pattern, and why the tight funnel toward a single vendor was operationally irregular and worthy of flagging. Finally, he directed that the office begin active monitoring rather than passive curiosity. Every new filing tied to the energy initiative was to be tagged and surveilled, especially those listing SkyTrail or donors in the same cluster of LLCs and nonprofits. Automated alerts would route to Debbie's inbox and to his own briefing binder. He wanted no gaps between the moment an amended report landed on the state's servers and the moment someone in that room knew it existed. When the meeting shift slid back into ordinary business, deadlines, minor clerical corrections, stray candidate errors, he participated as he always did, asking occasional questions, signing a few routine approvals. But his eyes kept returning to the 3-step flow he'd just written down. Donors, PACs, SkyTrail. By the time the briefing wrapped, he had already sketched his next sequence. The donor entities needed to be pulled out of the finance view and into the business entity system. Their formation documents, registered agents, and organizers would need to be paired with Debbie's memo. Only then would he bring in Chief Counsel Cloud McCandless and Deputy Counsel Ave Jacobian to decide whether the pattern was merely unusual or sufficiently structured to warrant a formal examination. The office did not guess. It built records and then acted. Back at her own workstation, Debbie reassembled the picture from scratch. She reopened the campaign finance dashboard, reloaded the Energy Reliability and Jobs Act, and stretched the window out from 6 months to 12. She set the filters deliberately. Wyoming registered LLCs and nonprofits as donors, contributions of $25,000 or more, and transactions where the recipient was one of the 3 energy PACs. The list that returned was short but stubbornly repetitive. 5 Wyoming entities appeared again and again as givers into the 3 PACs: Elk Creek Holdings, Big Sage Consulting, Cottonwood Outreach, Prairie Horizon Institute, and Coal Basin Heritage Network. On the filings, they looked like conventional organizations. In the dashboard's temporal view, they all moved in near-identical patterns. She overlaid the SkyTrail disbursement timeline from the PACs onto the donor contribution timeline. The lines tracked almost perfectly. Donor money flowed into the PACs. Shortly thereafter, money left the PACs for SkyTrail in amounts and intervals that echoed the inbound wires. Nothing in that flow was inherently unlawful. Wyoming allowed wealthy donors to route money through entities so long as they respected the state's registration and reporting requirements. But the uniformity of the pattern, same donor cluster, same PACs, same vendor, same rhythm, marked it as structurally odd. She moved from the campaign finance environment into the Secretary of State's business entity database. One by one, she pulled each donor's registration file. Elk Creek had a mailing address in one town, Big Sage in another. Registered agents differed. Formation dates were staggered over more than a year. On the surface, it looked like a set of distinct Wyoming entities spread across the map. It was the continuity that lived in the fine print. In the organizer and attorney sections of the filings, one name surfaced with an unwelcoming frequency: Zelmanovitz, Feinblatt, and Hopgood, a Denver law firm. Sometimes its lawyers appeared as drafting counsel, sometimes as organizers, occasionally both. Not every entity listed the firm, but enough did to make coincidence unlikely. Debbie opened a separate research tab and began to search. She checked legal directories, trade publications, and public corporate filings. She limited herself to open sources, anything an ordinary citizen or reporter could find if they knew what to type. An older SEC filing surfaced first, a Form 10-K from 3 years prior in which Iron Mesa Capital, LP, a private equity firm, had listed Zelmanovitz, Feinblatt, and Hopgood as outside counsel on a refinancing deal. The asset at the heart of that disclosure was a coal-fired plant in Wyoming, the same facility now being held up as critical reliability infrastructure in the campaign materials for the Energy Reliability and Jobs Act. The overlap was not by itself incriminating. Large firms in Denver had long rosters of clients. But seeing the same firm's lawyers appear in the formation documents of multiple Wyoming donor entities now pushing money into a ballot campaign meant to cement the plant's place in the grid gave her reason to pause. She captured the relevant pages and citations, footnoted them in a draft memo, and kept digging. Her search turned up trade articles describing Iron Mesa's aggressive use of leveraged refinancing, a few minor regulatory notes, and some industry commentary about the challenges facing aging coal assets in the western states. She boxed the key references and let the rest sit in her working file for now. The pattern was still circumstantial. Different addresses, different agents, different formation dates, one recurring law firm, and a known distressed asset at the center of a public campaign. Enough, she decided, to merit clarity in a diagram. Debbie knew that everyone who needed to understand this wouldn't live in dashboards and spreadsheets. Vaughn, she had learned, liked to see things in structures he could hold in his hands. She took a blank sheet of paper and drew 3 concentric circles. In the outer ring, she wrote donors and listed the 5 recurring Wyoming entities. In the middle ring, she wrote the 3 PAC names. At the core, she printed SkyTrail Communications in heavy ink and circled it twice. Along the margin, she added Iron Mesa Capital and connected it back toward the donor ring with a single arrow, anchored by a reference to the SEC filing. Beside the arrow, she wrote the name of the Denver law firm. At the top of the page, she drafted a short note, a plain language explanation of why she believed the network likely traced back to a single out-of-state financier attempting to protect its investment in the coal plant being touted by the ballot measure. She flagged the fact that this conclusion still rested on inference, not direct admissions, and pointed Vaughn toward the attached packet of research for anyone who wanted to check her logic. She clipped the diagram to the front of the memo, printed a second copy for herself, and sent Joven a quick instruction to archive the underlying queries under the same Energy Initiative label they had agreed on in the Monday briefing. The pattern now existed in three forms: as code and filters in the division's systems, as an analyst's narrative in the memo, and as a set of simple circles on paper. When Debbie and Joven stepped into Vaughn's office, he cleared a broad section of his desk and motioned for them to lay everything out. They placed the one-page network diagram on top, then arranged the memo, the supporting printouts from the business registry, and the public filings along the side. Joven stood close enough to field any questions about specific queries if needed. Vaughn read the diagram first. The circles captured exactly what he had felt in the abstract during the Monday briefing. An outer ring of donors, a middle ring of committees, and SkyTrail alone at the center. He moved to the memo. Debbie had kept to the disciplined tone he preferred. She described the 12-month pattern, the donors' repeated appearance, the alignment between inbound wires to the PACs and outbound payments to SkyTrail, and the narrowness of the vendor field. She did not speculate on motive. She simply pointed out that the structure differed meaningfully from other statewide ballot campaigns in recent history. In the business filings, he saw the same Denver law firm recurring across the donor entities. In the attached SEC and trade documents, he saw Iron Mesa Capital described as a key creditor and equity holder in the coal plant at issue. The ballot measure, if passed, would reclassify the plant and the associated transmission line as critical reliability infrastructure, a designation with multiple downstream effects. Extended regulatory life, a more favorable environment for cost recovery, and a firmer basis for projecting revenue. Those factors, taken together, would make it easier for a firm like Iron Mesa to refinance the asset on favorable terms and, if desired, sell its position at a premium rather than absorb a loss. He recognized the name. It had surfaced in prior briefings when the House had first taken testimony on the initiative's broad strokes. At the time, the initiative had been framed as a story about keeping lights on and jobs local. On paper, in Debbie's circles and the filings, a more concentrated narrative appeared. One heavily leveraged creditor seeking to protect and eventually exit its investment, using local entities to make its case look homegrown. He slid the entire stack back into a folder, a weathered Rimowa leather briefcase now serving as his portable archive for matters he refused to treat casually. Inside went Debbie's memo, the diagram, the entity trail, the law firm overlap, the Iron Mesa link, and a short section she had added outlining where the state's campaign finance framework might intersect with what they were seeing. His next instinct was not to call a reporter or a colleague. It was to call someone who looked at money all day. Before he set a strategy with legal counsel, he wanted a neutral technical read from outside government, a banker's view on whether the pattern of zero-to-zero flows and single-purpose accounts showed anything that a compliance department would consider red flag territory. That meant a trip to Jackson and a conversation with Tolliver Bean. The drive to Jackson gave Vaughn several hours to grind his questions down to the bone marrow. He used the time the way he had used long stretches of highway as a legislator. Legal pad on the passenger seat, questions drafted at rest stops, revised at fuel pumps, and reshaped between mountain passes. By the time he walked through the glass doors of Berry Latch and Bean Wealth Management, his goal was clear. Get an experienced financial professional to look at an anonymized series of transactions and tell him whether they resembled ordinary campaign giving, aggressive but lawful structuring, or something closer to plumbing designed to move someone else's money. He chose to present Tolliver with a spreadsheet stripped to its bones, dates and amounts only. Donors, committees, and vendors reduced to generic labels. No names, no law firms, no reference to Wyoming or coal or politics. Just a 9-month series of entries showing funds moving from multiple LLCs into a handful of PACs, then onwards to a vendor, again and again. He wanted to avoid the appearance of tainting the banker's view with context. He wanted to know what the pattern itself said to someone who lived in the language of accounts and balances. Tolliver reviewed the sheet with the same steady focus he applied to client portfolio reports. His first pass yielded what any prudent advisor would say. There were many reasons money might move in clean lines like this. Pooled investment vehicles, short-term cash aggregation, project-level LLCs, and even certain campaign structures could produce sequences of wires that looked orderly at a glance. On its own, the pattern did not automatically equate to wrongdoing. At Vaughn's request, he took a second, slower pass. That was when the detail emerged that Vaughn had not given sufficient weight. At the start of each cycle, each LLC's balance sat near zero. Each account then received a wire for an amount that almost perfectly matched the subsequent outward transfer to a PAC, plus a small, consistent leftover amount. After the PAC transfer, the account fell back to the same negligible residue it had started with. The cycle repeated month after month, entity after entity. Healthy accounts, Tolliver observed, tended to show life. They reflected rent payments, utility bills, small recurring charges, random fees, and the erratic rhythm of real activity. They did not routinely empty themselves to near zero and then refill in a way that matched the exact outbound obligation. These accounts, as presented, behaved less like entities with their own purposes and more like pass-through valves. Money did not live in them. It merely traveled through them in measured doses to predetermined downstream recipients. In banking compliance, such patterns prompted questions. They suggested that the account existed solely to create a legal person between the original source of funds and the ultimate recipient, without adding any genuine business function. That, in turn, could implicate anti-money laundering concerns in other contexts or, in a campaign finance setting, raise questions about whether disclosure rules were being gamed. The conclusion did not turn the sheet into an indictment, but it supplied a vocabulary for what Vaughn had felt and could not yet name. On the drive back to Cheyenne, he summarized the meeting in a short note and added it to the folder. A neutral, anonymized pattern reviewed by a senior wealth manager. General explanations considered. Recurring zero-to-zero cycles identified as indicative of pass-through accounts rather than operating entities. The banker's view did not answer the underlying question of motive. It did, however, harden Vaughn's sense that the state's disclosure machinery was being used as a facade rather than a window. The time had come to move from analysis to authority. Back in Cheyenne, Vaughn convened the first real strategy meeting. He brought Chief Counsel Cloud McCandless, Deputy Counsel Ave Jacobian, and Debbie Wren into a small conference room with no external windows and a door that shut softly but firmly. He laid the folder on the table and worked through its contents in sequence. Debbie started, walking through the graph of donor LLCs and nonprofits feeding the 3 PACs, the consistent flow to SkyTrail, and the legal but highly concentrated structure. She outlined the business filing overlaps, the recurring presence of Zelmanovitz, Feinblatt, and Hopgood, and the inferred connection to Iron Mesa's investment in the coal plant. Vaughn added the Jackson piece. He described the anonymized spreadsheet, the banker's view of the accounts as pass-through vehicles, and the conclusion that the pattern resembled crafted plumbing more than ordinary donor behavior. He framed the central question not in terms of policy preference on the ballot issue, but in terms of the office's statutory responsibilities. The problem before them was not whether the Energy Reliability and Jobs Act was good policy. The problem was what the Secretary of State's office was required to do when confronted with evidence that the transparency framework underpinning a live ballot measure might be deliberately circumvented. Cloud took the problem from there. She pulled the relevant statutory volume onto the table and walked the room through the sections in Title 22 that governed campaign finance. She identified provisions giving the office authority to receive, review, and audit campaign reports. She noted the conditions under which the Secretary of State could convert a routine filing review into a formal examination when reports were incomplete, inconsistent with other information on file, or when patterns suggested that disclosures were materially misleading. She also outlined the tools that came into play once such an examination was opened. Civil subpoena power could be used to compel production of supporting documents, contracts, invoices, donor agreements, when voluntary cooperation failed. Administrative proceedings could be initiated for violations leading to fines. In extreme cases, matters could be referred to the Attorney General for potential civil or criminal enforcement under broader fraud statutes. Ave added the administrative law lens. Under the state's General Administrative Procedure Act, the Secretary's office could promulgate emergency rules when necessary to address a significant gap or threat within its jurisdiction, provided the rule was narrow, time-limited, and justified on the record. That power had been used sparingly in the past, often around technical adjustments to filing deadlines or form requirements, but it existed nonetheless. They agreed that inaction was not a viable option. The discovery of a tight, heavily engineered funding structure in the middle of a ballot campaign, combined with delayed or opaque responses to routine inquiries, would become its own scandal if the office simply watched it pass. Vaughn asked for a structured menu rather than an open-ended brainstorm. Cloud and Ave left with instructions to prepare an options memo outlining 3 paths: a light-touch approach using existing audit authority and guidance letters, a moderate approach layering formal review notices and targeted subpoenas onto that base, and a more aggressive route built around emergency rulemaking to compel ultimate source of funds disclosures for large entities. He emphasized one last constraint. Whatever path they recommended, it had to be defensible in its neutrality. The office would pursue transparency, not outcomes, and would need to withstand scrutiny from courts, legislators, and voters who might not share the same policy preferences on the energy measure. 2 days later, Cloud returned with the options memo and a set of draft documents clipped beneath it. Sitting at his desk, Vaughn read the memo slowly. The light touch option involved sending informal guidance letters to the PACs, clarifying expectations for supporting documentation under existing law, and signaling that their reports had attracted attention. It was the most deferential path, suitable for cases where anomalies might still be explained by confusion rather than duplicity. The middle path proposed formal review notices invoked under the office's existing audit authority. Each notice would lay out the observable concerns, concentration of spending, unusual donor patterns, timing, and request specific supporting materials, contracts with SkyTrail, invoices, donor agreements, and internal policies. These requests would carry clear deadlines and the implicit backing of the office's power to escalate into subpoenas if necessary. The aggressive option proposed an emergency rule requiring immediate detailed disclosure of ultimate funding sources for high-dollar contributions from Wyoming entities to ballot-measure committees, with suspensions triggered for noncompliance. That path would maximize transparency, but would risk both legal challenges and perceptions of overreach in the middle of an active campaign. Vaughn considered his own discomfort with altering rules midstream for said campaigns. Emergency rulemaking remained on the table as a tool, but he was wary of deploying it as a first strike. The moderate path allowed the office to test the committee's willingness to be transparent using instruments already present in statute. He turned to the draft notices. Each letter was written in neutral, almost clinical prose. The opening paragraphs acknowledged receipt of the committee's filings and cited the sections of Title 22 that empowered the office to examine them. The next section described the observed patterns. Significant independent expenditures in support of the Energy Reliability and Jobs Act, large donations from a small number of Wyoming entities, and corresponding payments to a single vendor, SkyTrail Communications. The letters then requested supporting documentation. The lists were precise, unredacted contracts and invoices between the committee and SkyTrail, agreements or correspondence outlining arrangements with the largest donor LLCs and nonprofits, internal policies or board resolutions referenced in the committee's own filings. The closing paragraphs set firm deadlines and reminded recipients of the office's audit authority. Vaughn checked each line for neutrality. The letters made no allegations. They did not imply wrongdoing. They simply stated that the disclosed patterns justified further review and that the office expected cooperation. One by one, he signed them. He instructed Cloud to coordinate with the Elections Division Director, Winslow Turelli, on delivery logistics. Each notice would go out by certified mail to the committee's official address of record, with electronic copies emailed to the treasurers and registered contacts. The Elections Division would log the date and time of each mailing and any receipts. Debbie and Joven created a simple timeline grid on the wall outside his office, 1 row per pack, 3 columns for date sent, date responded, and a shorthand assessment of response quality. The first column was to be filled with the date of mailing as soon as the letters left the building. The other 2 remained blank, waiting for whatever the committees chose to do. The notices were the procedural equivalent of a gentle rap on the door. Whether they would need to reach for the hammer later would depend on what, if anything, came back through the mail slot. When the response window began to close, the timeline outside Vaughn's office looked largely unchanged. The left column, date sent, remained neat and uniform. The middle column showed 2 delayed entries written in a different pen. The right column contained only a few quick assessments in Debbie's handwriting. Partial narrative only, incomplete attachment set, extension requested, no follow-up. Inside the conference room, Cloud had set printed copies of each response alongside the original notice. Vaughn took his seat and worked through them, one committee at a time. On paper, each reply opened with a respectful nod to the Secretary of State's authority and an expression of commitment to compliance. In substance, each letter followed the same choreography. One committee asserted that it took donor privacy seriously and had strict internal policies governing disclosure, then declined to provide unredacted contracts on the grounds that they included proprietary business information. It provided high-level descriptions of services rendered by SkyTrail, but no invoices. A second acknowledged the transfers as reported, but claimed that certain donor agreements were not readily accessible, citing turnover and record-keeping challenges. It offered to provide similar agreements from past cycles as representative samples, while suggesting that the current ones were functionally identical and therefore unnecessary. A third asked for more time, explaining that its counsel needed to complete an internal review before producing documents, and proposed a new date for possible compliance that landed comfortably and perhaps suspiciously beyond the election. Debbie's notes in the margins were minimal but pointed. She highlighted references to policies that were never attached, underlined claims that documents could not be located despite recent complex financial transactions, and circled places where narrative assurances were offered in lieu of records. Joven cross-referenced each missing piece with the network graph and transaction timelines, marking each mismatch with a small notation. From Vaughn's vantage point, the pattern was unmistakable. The committees had either not misunderstood the requests or were deliberately and willingly obfuscating the process. They had chosen to respond at the last possible moment, in the narrowest possible way, offering words where documents had been requested and procedure where substance had been sought. He felt the familiar pull toward generosity in interpretation, the instinct to assume that busy people with limited staff and nervous counsel simply stumbled in the face of government letters. But the sequence of delays, the care with which deadlines were skirted rather than met, and the convenient timing of proposed future cooperations suggested something else entirely. This was not confusion. It was a set play. The people behind the packs were buying time. Every day spent on correspondence and procedural objections was another day in which SkyTrail's ads stayed on the air and Iron Mesa's position remained protected. Once the initiative went to a vote, the story behind the money would become, in their calculus, the province of historians and watchdogs, not voters. Vaughn looked up at the timeline on the wall. The empty space in the last column no longer reflected mere absence. It now represented contumacy. He opened a fresh legal pad and divided a page into two lists. On the first, he wrote the records that mattered most. Unredacted contracts and invoices between the PACs and SkyTrail, donor agreements between the PACs and the largest Wyoming entities, and any internal documents outlining the donor screening and acceptance policies cited in the letters. These would form the core of targeted civil subpoenas. On the second, he wrote a short instruction for Cloud and Ave. Activate the emergency rule concept from the earlier options memo into concrete language. The rule would require PACs that received large contributions from Wyoming entities above a certain threshold to disclose the ultimate source of funds, defined to cut past shell entities to the actual upstream provider of capital. He authorized Cloud to begin drafting subpoenas aimed precisely at the missing documents and to prepare emergency rule text that could be filed if the pattern of obstruction continued. The office had knocked softly. The responses had been scripted deferrals. The next contact would carry a more lawful force. Within days, Cloud had both sets of documents ready: draft subpoenas and a proposed emergency rule. The subpoenas were narrow. Each named a specific committee and cited its own reports, the earlier notice, and the inadequate response. Each commanded production of defined records, copies of all contracts and invoices between the committee and SkyTrail Communications for the relevant period. Agreements or communications with listed Wyoming LLC and nonprofit donors regarding contributions to the Energy Reliability and Jobs Act campaign and internal policies or board resolutions governing acceptance and disclosure of such contributions. Deadlines were set with enough time to be reasonable, but not enough to render the exercise meaningless for the ongoing election. The emergency rule draft was more elaborate. Cloud had anchored it in the existing statutory mandate to ensure full and timely disclosure of campaign finance information. The rule applied only to political committees participating in statewide ballot issues that received contributions above a high dollar threshold from Wyoming registered entities. For those contributions, committees would be required to file a supplemental affidavit identifying the ultimate source of funds, the individual, partnership, corporation, or organization that had provided the money to the Wyoming entity for the specific purpose of political activity. The draft defined key terms with care. Wyoming entity was limited to business organizations and nonprofits formed under Wyoming law. Ultimate source of funds was defined in a way that prevented compliance through naming a shell. It required identification of the original provider of funds that were then forwarded by the entity for political use. The rule's mechanics were spelled out in procedural steps. Filing would occur with the Secretary of State's Rules Office, accompanied by a written statement justifying the emergency nature of the action, primarily the imminent election and the apparent structuring of contributions to obscure origin. The rule would take effect on the earliest date allowed under administrative procedure. Affected committees would receive written notice detailing the new affidavit requirement and the deadline for compliance, with explicit warning that failure to file would trigger suspension of further spending related to the ballot issue until compliance. Importantly, Cloud had built in a sunset clause. The emergency rule would expire automatically after a fixed period, forcing the legislature to decide whether to codify, amend, or discard it in the next session. Vaughn subjected the draft to the same internal test he had applied to his Grizzly pilot framework. If a judge, a hostile legislator, or a skeptical voter read it cold, would it look like a targeted attack or a principled closure of a transparency gap? The rule did not mention Iron Mesa, SkyTrail, or any specific committee. It did not touch message content, policy positions, or partisan alignments. It required truth-telling about funding, and it applied only to large contributions routed through Wyoming entities, where the risk of concealment was highest. He signed the emergency rule filing. Cloud and Ave took it from there, submitting the text to the State Rules Registry, accompanied by a written justification. Coordinating with Elections Director Winslow Turelli and his staff on identifying committees that crossed the threshold, drafting notices to those committees and working with Secretary of State Communications Director Tindra Umland to prepare a plain English explanation for the public and press. In tandem, Vaughn signed the subpoenas. Those would go out through certified channels and be tracked as closely as any ballot. The office had moved from analysis to rule. On the morning the new affidavit deadline hit, Vaughn felt the need to scrape off some of the bureaucratic crust that had formed on his frontal lobe and asked his small core team to meet him somewhere other than the usual conference room. The Wyoming State Library's reading room, with its tall windows and oak tables, felt like a neutral ground in which to view what would come in as a matter of public record rather than partisan contest. They gathered at one of the longer tables, Vaughn at the head, Cloud to his right with a legal pad, Debbie opposite with her laptop open, and Joven beside her with the campaign finance filing system ready. Debbie refreshed the system's view and filtered for affidavits filed under the emergency rule. Two committees had either remained silent or had submitted perfunctory documents that, upon closer inspection, failed to name any upstream sources despite obvious high-dollar entity contributions. Suspension orders for those committees' further expenditures on the ballot issue had already been signed and transmitted. Their records would now join the subpoena files and, potentially, the Attorney General's docket. One committee, however, Windridge Citizens Alliance, had defied belief and filed a complete affidavit. The document moved quickly from boilerplate to substance. Donor tables listed familiar Wyoming entities in one column and, in the newly required column, the ultimate sources of funds behind those contributions. For smaller donations, the trail ended at individual Wyoming residents and local businesses. For the large recurring entity contributions, the affidavit finally named what Debbie's arrows had only implied. A partnership capitalized and controlled by Iron Mesa Capital, which had provided funds to Elk Creek, Big Sage, Cottonwood Outreach, Prairie Horizon Institute, and Coal Basin Heritage Network for the express purpose of supporting the Energy Reliability and Jobs Act through Windridge. The affidavit was signed by the committee's treasurer, Eben Nogarelli. Cloud's profile on him, prepared earlier, described a compliance lawyer with a solid resume and no prior discipline. A man whose professional instincts would naturally lean toward full, technically precise cooperation once the law told him what truth was required. Vaughn considered the decision embedded in that signature. When presented with the choice between continuing to shield an upstream financier and complying with a newly clarified rule at real cost to powerful interests, the treasurer had opted for explicit disclosure. Motives, conscience, fear of perjury, career preservation could be debated. The act itself stood clear. From the Secretary of State's perspective, the path forward was elementary. The affidavit would be scanned and indexed into the campaign finance database associated with Windridge, the relevant reporting period, the emergency rule, and Iron Mesa as the ultimate source. The Elections Division, under Winslow Turelli, would add a public-facing link to its portal, allowing any citizen, journalist, or legislator to access the document without specialized knowledge of the system. Secretary of State Communications Director Tindra Umland would issue a plain language notice explaining the new affidavits and pointing the public toward them. Cloud's notes for an Attorney General referral packet had already been drafted in anticipation of this moment. The packet would now include Debbie's original network analysis, the timelines of contributions and expenditures, the initial notices and inadequate responses from the other PACs, the subpoenas, the suspension orders, and Windridge's sworn admission tying the concealment structure back to Iron Mesa and to the donor entities it had funded. The two non-compliant PACs and Iron Mesa itself would sit at the center of that referral as potential violators of state campaign finance and fraud laws. Within the Attorney General's office, lead investigator Ursuline Twining would shoulder much of the practical work, turning the packet into interviews, document reviews, and eventually proposed counts on a charging document. Attorney General Juanita Jazz would decide what theories to advance. Ursuline Twining would build the factual scaffolding beneath them. The law firm Zelmanovitz, Feinblatt, and Hopgood, having served as organizer and counsel for multiple donor entities and advisor to Iron Mesa, would be included where evidence supported a role in designing the structure. That portion of the packet would travel in due course to bar authorities as well. Vaughn rested his hand briefly on the affidavit's cover before passing it back across the table. He had not, in this episode, tried to dictate energy policy or decide whether the coal plant deserved another decade. He had used his office to drag a concealed funding architecture into daylight and to place the resulting facts on the only desk in Wyoming, Attorney General Juanita Jazz's, that could decide whether they warranted prosecution. For a Secretary of State, that was the appropriate endpoint. The next phase would belong to another branch. 14 months later, the consequences had taken on the form that state systems recognized best: case numbers, verdict forms, and sentencing orders. The First Judicial District Court in Cheyenne had drawn the prosecutions arising from the Iron Mesa structure. Vaughn sat in the gallery midway up, well out of the range of cameras and sketch artists. He had already testified earlier in the proceedings about the office's procedures and the sequence of disclosures and rulemakings. Today, he was there only to observe. At the state's table sat Senior Assistant Attorney General Rowdy Paulkin, his files neatly organized, his notes reduced to a few annotated pages. The jury had returned guilty verdicts weeks earlier on counts of conspiracy, false campaign filings, and structured concealment against Iron Mesa Capital as an entity, its chief executive officer, Milo Janis, personally, and designated officers of two of the PACs that had chosen defiance over cooperation. The law firms Zelmanovitz, Feinblatt, and Hopgood, and two of its senior partners, had been named in a separate indictment on charges of aiding and abetting structured concealment and filing of false statements. Based on evidence that they had provided, namely template formation documents and strategy memoranda explicitly designed to route funds through layers of Wyoming entities to obscure Iron Mesa's involvement. Judge Elawin Malmson, presiding, moved through the sentencing hearing with the brisk, precise cadence of a jurist who expected the record to endure scrutiny. She began by formally denying the last of the post-trial motions. She then set out the statutory ranges for each count, noting on the record the aggravating factors that applied, the scale of expenditures involved, the deliberate nature of the structuring, the impact on a statewide ballot initiative that voters had been told was driven by local interests, and the coordinated resistance to lawful disclosure efforts by the Secretary of State's office. She also took care to catalog mitigating factors where they genuinely existed. Eben Nogarelli's early and comprehensive affidavit and subsequent cooperation featured prominently. Internal law firm emails showed that he had faced internal pressure to withhold information even after the emergency rule and yet had chosen compliance. Disciplinary boards and sentencing courts rarely rewarded perfection. They did occasionally reward people who changed course before the wreck. For Iron Mesa's CEO, the calculus produced a substantial result. Milo Janis received a multi-year state prison sentence with a portion suspended, conditioned on strict post-release supervision. Iron Mesa itself was fined in the seven-figure range, ordered to disgorge profits attributable to the extended life of the coal plant secured through the deceptive campaign, and barred by court order from making or funneling political contributions in Wyoming for a period exceeding a decade. The two PAC officers who had signed false filings and orchestrated evasive responses received shorter but still significant custodial sentences and heavy personal fines, along with bans from serving as officers or treasurers of political committees for a long stretch. For Zelmanovitz, Feinblatt, and Hopgood, the outcome was a mixture of financial penalty and professional sanctions. The firm was ordered to pay substantial fines and to disgorge fees earned from its work on the Wyoming entities and related campaign activities. The record reflected that the court had referred the same conduct to the Colorado and Wyoming bar authorities for ethics review, with bar counsel Eureka Oberlander assigned as the disciplinary prosecutor to assemble the case against the attorneys who had designed and approved the structures. Under the judgment, the firm was also prohibited from representing clients in matters involving Wyoming campaign finance law for a specified period. Nogarelli, the treasurer who had filed the affidavit, received a felony conviction and a sizable fine, but walked out of court with a suspended custodial sentence conditioned on continued cooperation with regulatory and disciplinary bodies. The court made clear that his early disclosure had not erased his role, but had substantially altered the outcome. From the gallery, Vaughn watched the scheme he had first seen as a glowing graph on a screen reduce itself into docket entries and obligations. There were no speeches about good and evil, just the steady click of the courtroom clerk's keyboard as he transcribed the orders into the permanent record. At some point during the hearing, someone slipped into the space beside him. When he glanced sideways, he recognized Governor Sullivan Toth. The governor had come alone, coat open, expression fixed on the bench rather than on the room. Vaughn already knew from public reports that Toth did not intend to seek another term. Sitting there now, as the consequences of the Iron Mesa case were being quantified, the governor represented both an endpoint and a hinge. At a midpoint in the proceedings, Toth leaned minimally toward Vaughn and, in a tone pitched for one person rather than many, indicated that he wished to speak with him later that evening about a matter he considered important. No details, just the request. By the time Judge Malmson's final gavel strike reverberated against the courtroom's wood, the space beside Vaughn's seat was empty. The governor had slipped out ahead of the crowd. The case that had begun as an oddity in a Monday briefing had now been processed fully by the state's legal arm. For Vaughn's office, the file would close with the judgment. For his own life, another file was about to open. The private dinner at the governor's residence, the long conversation about trust, disclosure, and the shape of future campaigns, and the eventual request that Vaughn run for governor himself belonged to a separate chapter. The months that followed unfolded in the compressed, exhausting pattern familiar to anyone who had ever chased a statewide office in a sparsely populated state. County fairs and courthouse steps, school gyms and stockyards, high school auditoriums and VFW halls. For Vaughn, the campaign did not revolve around Iron Mesa, but the case shadowed every stop. Voters in small towns wanted to know whether he believed in coal or wind, water pipelines or broadband, but they also wanted to know whether he understood why the funding scandal had angered them, regardless of where they fell on the policy itself. He explained the case again and again, always returning to the same core point, that it was not about being for or against an energy source. It was about whether Wyoming's rules meant what they said. He tried to speak in the plain sequence he had learned to trust, what the office could do, what it could not do, and what he wanted the next 10 years to look like if the state invested in boring, essential work rather than chasing spectacle. The primary was narrow enough to feel uncertain until the last votes were tallied. The general election was a grind, lean in money, heavy in miles. When it finally ended with a victory, he found himself standing once again with a hand raised, this time swearing an oath as governor rather than Secretary of State. Weeks later, KFRW 97.9 studio in Cheyenne felt almost comically small for the scale of that journey. He sat in front of the microphone, headphones muffling the outside world, wrists resting lightly on the edge of the desk. Across from him, Ginny Jane Norwood moved through the practiced rhythm of a broadcaster who had seen governors come and go. She introduced him to listeners as Wyoming's new governor and sketched in a few quick sentences the arc from small-town mayor to Secretary of State to the state's chief executive. In her framing, the Iron Mesa case became a hinge rather than a footnote. She reminded listeners that he had been the official who had pressed for full disclosure and pushed the matter into a courtroom. She highlighted the way that episode had fed his reputation as a process-first public servant, someone more interested in fair rules than in partisan win-loss tallies. During the segment, he laid out his initial agenda much as he had during the campaign, tightening transparency standards further, rebuilding and deepening trust with county clerks and local officials, improving core infrastructure in overlooked regions, treating water, roads, education, and broadband as foundational obligations rather than optional programs. He drew lines between the quiet procedural work of election integrity and the larger themes of institutional trust, making the case that small, invisible rules either supported or undermined the big things voters truly cared about. Near the end of the broadcast, Ginny Jane shifted her tone to something lighter, more tongue-in-cheek. She described his meteoric rise for the benefit of listeners and mused how unusual it was for someone to move from a town of just a few hundred to the governor's palace in a relatively short span. An awe-inspiring feat, no less. She teased out the rhetorical question of how far a trajectory like that could go in American politics, touching briefly on the phrase executive office in a way that left most listeners smiling rather than scrutinizing. When the red on-air light finally dimmed and the outro music faded, producer Orson Gautreaux signaled that the segment had ended. Handshakes and brief pleasantries followed, compressed into the minute between one show ending and the next production cycle beginning. Outside, late light over Cheyenne flattened colors into a uniform pale gold. In the quiet of his car, hands resting on the steering wheel before he turned the key, Vaughn replayed the past few years in reverse. The Monday briefing room where a cluster of names had first caught his attention. The small conference rooms where he and Cloud had argued over commas in an emergency rule. The courtroom where a judge had turned structured evasion into prison time and fines. Even the library table where an affidavit had finally named the source. He thought briefly about the phrase that had been floated in the studio, the way it had hung in the air more as a jest than as a roadmap. The idea of a higher national office felt abstract, almost indulgent, against the concrete pile on his desk. Next year's budget, next season's fire preparedness, the slow, unglamorous work of stewarding a state. He started the engine and pulled out of the station lot, steering back toward the Capitol and the files waiting upstairs. Ambition, in his mind, had always been less about climbing ladders than about accepting larger rings of responsibility. For now, the ring around Wyoming's borders felt large enough. Whatever jokes others chose to make about where the road might lead, he intended to measure his success the same way he had measured it as a county commissioner, a legislator, and a secretary of state, by whether the people could see in the bones of the system that someone had taken the rules seriously. And Vaughn took pride in being a very serious person.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Bye-bye.